go north, you must journey south. To reach the west, you must go east. To go forward, you must go back. And to touch the light, you must pass beneath the shadow. What is there in Asshai that I will not find in Qarth? Truth. So what truth is Quaithe talking about? Well, Quaithe returns later and says, Daenerys, remember the Undying. Remember who you are. Now in past videos I've mentioned briefly that Dany's past is not what she thinks it is, but before we go on to Dany's adventures in Qarth, I really need to hammer this point home. There are serious differences between what Daenerys remembers about her childhood and the world we know. So let's go over everything Daenerys remembers about the house with the red door. Daenerys remembers Sir Willem Darry dimly, a great bear of a man, half-blind, roaring and bellowing orders from his sickbed. He never left his bed though, and the smell of sickness clung to him day and night, a hot, moist, sickly sweet odor. This isn't the only smell she remembers, she also remembers the smell of perfumes, maybe to cover up Sir Willem Darry's death smell. Daenerys believes the house with the red door is in Braavos, and she remembers a lemon tree outside the window of her room. Her room also had some odd wooden beams with animal faces carved in them. The house with the red door is very consistently called a big house, though on one occasion when dreaming of Daario, she calls it a tall stone house. Now, after Sir Willem had died, the servants had stolen what little money they had left, and soon they were put out of the big house. Now there seems to be a reoccurring memory of Daenerys running barefoot towards the house with the red door. We first get a notion of it when Dany hears children outside the walls of Illyrio's estate. Dany wishes she could be out there, barefoot and breathless, with no past and no future. Later in the Dothraki Sea, Daenerys suddenly has the urge to go barefoot. Viserys asks her, "Have you forgotten who you are? Look at you! Look at you!" But Dany did not need to look. She was barefoot, with oiled hair, wearing Dothraki riding leathers. Daenerys later has a fever dream where she's walking barefoot down a stone hallway towards a red door. She walked faster, and her bare feet left bloody footprints on the stone. She leaves the hallway, passes through the Dothraki Sea, and then sees home. She could smell home. She could see it, there, just beyond that door. Green fields and great stone houses, and arms to keep her warm. And Dany's bare feet keep returning. At the House of the Undying, she receives a vision of a little girl running barefoot towards a big house with a red door. Later on, in A Storm of Swords, Dany walks barefoot out onto her grass terrace, and she looks for a house with a red door. And later in A Dance with Dragons, she goes back out to that same grass terrace barefoot and is visited by Quaithe, who tells her to remember who she is. And finally, A Dance with Dragons ends with Dany back in the Dothraki Sea, again barefoot. She's again visited by Quaithe, who again tells her to remember who she is. So the house with the red door seems to be a big, tall stone house, and according to Dany's fever dream, it's among other stone houses. Dany's room has wooden beams inside it, and outside its window is a lemon tree. A hot, moist, sickly sweet smell and the smell of perfumes really define the smell of Dany's childhood. And Dany seems to have a memory of running towards the house with the red door, barefoot. And Dany's fever dream, along with a love for walking barefoot in grass, seem to point to green fields being around the house. But fundamentally, the house with the red door represents an ideal place to live for Dany. She dreams of it often, yet Dany thinks the house with the red door is in Braavos, a city described as dreary and uninviting. The city is almost always covered in fog, and fog is caused by cool air. Arya tells us there are 3 types of weather in the city: fog, rain, and freezing rain. Sam tells us that everywhere in the city is riddled with wet winds and salt spray. This doesn't sound like an ideal environment, and doesn't sound like a place for hot, moist smells, or a place to be running barefoot. And speaking of smells, Arya tells us that Braavos smells like brine and fish, which is understandable considering it's by the sea. Yet weirdly, Daenerys says perfumes define the smell of her childhood. Daenerys does like the smell of salt air, but she associates it with trips across the narrow sea, and not with the house with the red door. Now, Braavos is a city of many islands, linked together by innumerable canals, and its streets are made up of a slick cobblestone. It's again not really a place to be running towards a house with a red door. The city is also devoid of trees, making the wooden beams in Dany's room seem out of place. Wood is massively costly in Braavos, and thus the entire city is made of stone. Braavos is also home of the Iron Bank, which is useful if you don't want your money stolen, say from servants. But of course, the biggest thing that makes one think there's something wrong with Dany's memory is the lemon tree outside her window. A cold, wet, wind-swept port town is not exactly where one would expect citrus to grow. And the characters of our story talk about this fact. For example, here's a conversation between Shama the innkeeper and Angai. "Hang this," she said, handing him a duck. "We were thinking we might eat it, Shama, with lemons, if you had some." "Lemons? And where would we get lemons? Does it look like Dorne to you, you freckled fool? Why don't you hop out back to the lemon tree and pick us a bushel?" The idea that lemons could grow in the Riverlands is comical, and the Riverlands is further south than Braavos. And the following conversation actually happens between two guards in Braavos. "I'm chilled to the bones. Where are the bloody orange trees? I've always heard there were orange trees in the Free Cities. Lemons and limes." "Down in Lice Mere and Old Volantis. Braavos is north of King's Landing, fool. Can't you read a bloody map?" It seems that the house with the red door is not in Braavos. Nonetheless, there's some arguments that it really is. For example, maybe Dany was living at the Sea Lord's palace. The palace is sort of like a big house. And maybe the Sea Lord has a greenhouse to keep that lemon tree in. Or maybe the lemon tree was brought up during a long summer. And maybe those fields that Dany remembers are really the Sea Lord's front yard. And since the Sea Lord is rich, he can certainly afford wooden beams. And although the Sea Lord's palace doesn't have a red door in this picture, perhaps the red door is off to the side or in the back. And maybe Sir Willem Darry just didn't like banks or didn't think he had enough money to use the bank. The Iron Bank is only across the street from the Sea Lord's palace, but then again, Sir Willem Darry is bedridden. And maybe finances were not on Viserys' mind. And maybe the ocean and the fish smells and the salt sprays were actually all part of Dany's memories. She just never brought them up. Who knows, anything is possible, but fundamentally, Daenerys associates the house with the red door with a life of simplicity. The Sea Lord's palace is not a house. It's a palace with hundreds of rooms and a zoo. There's nothing simple about it, and it's really hard to believe that anyone would have a memory of Braavos and not mention the sea, canals, or fog. After 5 books, not a single aspect of this is in Daenerys' memories. So Dany wasn't raised in Braavos. Who cares? How does this change anything? Well, fundamentally this means Viserys is a liar, and we don't know if anything about Daenerys' past is true. Now, I believe that Daenerys is secretly the child of Rhaegar and Lyanna. But none of this is really important. What's really important is a full rejection of Viserys' desires. Viserys and many others think that the most important thing is the Game of Thrones, but it's not. The most important thing is the Song of Ice and Fire. Daenerys has spent nearly all of her time trying to fulfill Viserys' dreams. Remember, Daenerys dreams of a red door, not an iron throne. And there are clearly more important things to think about in the world than who sits the Iron Throne. Rhaegar believed that he was a savior before he eventually accepted that he was the father of a savior. Daenerys' story is reversed. Drogo and the Green Grace, they all think that Daenerys will be the mother of a savior, when in fact she's the savior. Or at least one savior among many. In fact, disagreements about Daenerys' nature explain everything about her adventures in Qarth, which is why I went down this road in the first place. And so next time we'll be talking about Qarth, and a lot more about Quaithe. So next stop, the Red Waste.